Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're very happy to be here to be able to celebrate the career of Professor Leonard Tennenhouse, who retired at the beginning of this month, January 2023, after 14 years as a member of Duke's English department. 8 of those years as department chair. I'm Charlotte Sussman. I'm the current chair of the department. And I just want to say, after only 6 months in this job, my respect for what Len was able to do in this office has increased exponentially. It was already high, and it's gotten higher. I'm going to say a few words by way of introduction, and then hand it over to our panelists, who will discuss Len's scholarship, his teaching and mentorship, and his contribution to the profession. And I think they'll also touch on his immense personal kindness to so many of us here at Duke and in the profession more widely. Each panelist will introduce themselves as they speak. So I just want to say that we're doing this in a webinar format, so there's no chat, and we also won't be able to have questions or discussion at the end. We are, as you just saw, recording the event, however, and we'll be able to post it soon on the English department website if you want to see it or pass it along to people who weren't able to be here. If you would like to congratulate Len on his retirement, we'd be happy to forward any cards or thoughts to him, or you can just email him directly and he'll be able to see that. The department has also often been able to honor retiring faculty with an undergraduate essay prize in their name. We did that most recently for Barbara Herrnstein-Smith, and we plan to do this for Len either this year or the next. So it's impossible to sum up Len's career in just a few words. He's contributed to a remarkable variety of fields in many different ways, but I'm going to try for a minute to give an overview. Before coming to Duke, Len taught at Wayne State University, Brown University, and also held visiting professorships at a number of other places, and before arriving at Duke in 2014. His many books and edited collections include in the field of early modern literature, Power on Display, The Politics of Shakespeare's Genres, published in 1986. In the field of early and 19th century American literature, The Importance of Feeling English, American Literature and the British Diaspora, 1750 to 1850, which was published in 2007. And as just one example of the influential body of scholarship, he co-wrote with Nancy Armstrong the volume Novels in the Time of Democratic Writing, The American Example, which appeared in 2018. He's also the author and co-author of many, many articles and reviews. At Duke, he taught a variety of classes, many different approaches to Shakespeare. And I just want to mention a particularly well-loved undergraduate seminar that he taught a number of times called Literature and the Pursuit of Happiness. In all these ways, and in many more, Len gave enormously of himself to the profession, to Duke, and to its students, and to both to its students and to the department as a whole. This panel is just a small token of our gratitude for all of that. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first panelist, who is Professor Julianne Werlin.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's my very great privilege to have the chance to talk about Len's scholarship. The task is a daunting one. Len's body of work is formidable, taking on subjects from the Renaissance to the modern across England and America, and making use of, in some cases helping to invent, a host of methods. Alongside the variety and richness of his work, however, it is possible to see consistent preoccupations, which not only give it unity and meaning, but also suggest directions of research that are as stimulating today as at the date of their first publication. To me, Len's most striking insight, visible in every one of his works, is the idea that the history of literature is part of social history. And this is true not merely in terms of the incidents writers depict, or even the values they explicitly endorse, but in terms of the forms they use and the genres they work within. Such a perspective is evident from the very title of Len's 1986 book, Power on Display, The Politics of Shakespeare's Genres. This seminal study of Renaissance theater also came to be understood as a defining work of New Historicism, and it exemplifies one of New Historicism's most suggestive insights, that values are embedded in and enacted through cultural forms, from wedding ceremonies to coronations to comedies. This means that reading literature politically entails a rigorous attention to style and structure. Historicization can never collapse into mere contextualization, but always requires the interpretation of artistic conventions and codes. In taking this approach, Len's scholarship had sympathies with the work of Marxist critics such as Bakhtin, Lukács, and Williams, but his vision of the past departed from the work of such writers in important ways. For Len, the reproduction of the family, including structures of lineage, inheritance, kinship, sex, and sexuality, was at the very center of the politics of early modern England. Political history was social history, and vice versa. Together with fellow scholars, he showed that taking kinship as fundamental to the study of early modern literature could open new and surprising modes of understanding. This emphasis had obvious advantages in reading the literature of a society in the grip of a genealogical frenzy. Never before had the making of family trees been so widespread an obsession as at the beginning of the Jacobean era. It was certainly indispensable for the study of Shakespeare. In reading plays that turned on questions of inheritance and descent, paternal and filial feeling, and marriage and courtship, Len's keenly anthropological analysis of reproduction shed light on scene after scene. Considering the formation and maintenance of families, including the royal family as a key element of political and social life, made it possible to understand narrative form, character, and symbolism in historical terms. In a series of virtuosic readings, a particular favorite of mine is his dazzling interpretation of Twelfth Night's Petrarchan fantasies, he revealed the unity of the aesthetic and social aspects of Shakespeare's drama. And just as an aside, I saw his method in action when we co-taught a Shakespeare class together, and it was apparent to me that it was just as revelatory for undergraduates in many cases encountering Shakespeare's plays for the first time as it was for the history of Shakespearean scholarship. Len's gift for seeing literary form as a part of social history was again evident in the studies he co-wrote with Nancy, beginning with The Imaginary Puritan in 1992. In this book, Len and Nancy brought their shared interest in the history and development of the modern family to bear in literary history, beginning with Paradise Lost. And with this study, Len embarked on a new chapter in his research, which brought his skill at formal analysis and his sociological acumen to bear on the history of the book and the development of 18th and 19th century literature. His 2007 book, The Importance of Feeling English, American Literature and the British Diaspora, 1750 to 1850, was a product of this new path of research. The argument of this book is that Americans read and tried to rewrite English or British literature both before the American Revolution and long after it. Political independence did not create an instant schism, neatly severing one culture from the other. Working collaboratively, Len and Nancy had introduced versions of this claim in a series of influential articles in the preceding decade. But in The Importance of Feeling English, Len extended it and introduced new forms of evidence and new readings. What makes the book, to my mind, so remarkable is its genuine synthesis of techniques that are often treated separately. Using the empirical findings of book history about patterns of circulation and consumption, Len asked the vital question of what makes a literature. Where is there one literature and where are there several? Where are authors and readers members of a single reading and writing public, and where do they split? It's a fundamental question of literary history, addressed by Auerbach in his Latin Literature and its Public, among others, but it's also an exceedingly subtle one, which typically only comes into view for scholars whose work span significant stretches of time and space, like Len's. Len not only took on this question, but provided an original answer to it with respect to American literature. In his view, like that of Benedict Anderson, literature had the power to help demarcate a community. In contrast to Anderson, however, Len showed that in early America, that community took a diasporic form, not an inchoately national one. By breaking the link between the literary public and its forms of intimacy in the nation, Len was able to offer a new model of the politics of American literature grounded in the history of the book. This insight, as in Len's earlier work, provides the basis for powerful and surprising readings of plot and genre. For example, in his analysis of American uses of the European Gothic, and in my favorite chapter in the book, a particularly virtuosic chapter in American adaptations of seduction plots, including the American adaptation of Clarissa. Len would continue this line of research together with Nancy in their co-authored book, the important and already influential 2018 study, Novels in the Time of Democratic Writing. Although I've merely been able to touch on Len's scholarship in the short time I have, I hope I have given a sense of both its vast scope and its underlying coherence. Like all such contributions, it has once been tremendously influential and not yet influential enough. For my own scholarship in particular, Len's work feels more relevant every day. I've drawn on his interpretation of the reproduction of the family as determinative of sexual and social values, and therefore is one of the most important contexts of literary history, on patterns of textual circulation as a key to the cultivation of audiences, on the analysis of the assumptions and values implicit in major genres, especially Renaissance comedy and 19th century Gothic. Above all, however, reading through Len's work illustrates what all scholars of literature come to understand, that the resources of intellectual history, including literary scholarship, are our best guide to the future. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. It is an honor and a treat to celebrate Len Tennenhouse and the impact he's made throughout his career, not the least on his students. I am one such fortunate student. At Duke, I was a grad student of Len's, and I graduated in the class of 2015. From there, I worked as an assistant professor at a small university in Texas, and now find myself in my dream job as a continuous member of faculty at Red Deer Polytechnic in snowy but also very sunny Alberta, Canada. As I'm sure we'll all be immediately aware following what Julianne has mentioned, Len's list of contributions to academia is long and varied. But today I want to focus on a legacy that he leaves that might not be immediately visible on his extensive CV. Today I want to pay tribute to Len as a mentor. To this end, I'm going to discuss 3 more personal events that I think exemplify his stellar approach to mentorship and demonstrate the way he has made such an impact on generations of scholars. The first event is when Len offered me counsel when I had considered leaving Duke's PhD program to work full-time and support my mom, who found herself in financial hardship. Len encouraged me to focus on life's bigger picture, even when its immediate details threaten to distort this broader, more objective view. He explained that even though financial instability would be really rough, I would stand a better chance to support my mom if I completed the PhD and kept the door open for better, higher paying jobs in the future. He showed me that it was okay for life not to be immediately perfect, provided I kept moving toward a meaningful goal. Here, Len taught me to make sacrifices in service of a future where I could make a bigger impact in the lives of the people that I loved. But more important still, I think this event exemplifies the level of confidence and esteem in which Len holds his students. I mean, it's absolutely no secret that financial stability doesn't come easy or often in academia. But Len is so keenly and so adeptly able to identify the promise of his students that we have no choice but to believe that we too are capable of great things. And it's through his mentorship that he helps bring the bright futures that he sees for his students to fruition. In short, Len is the reason why I stayed at Duke, and as I'll later discuss, why I was able to complete my PhD. The second event I want to talk about is when Len responded to an emergency email sent at 4 a.m., one he acted upon by picking up a student who was in distress at 7 a.m. and driving them to the support resources they needed. This not only demonstrates the depth of Len's compassion and care, but also his ability to understand and address a student where they are. Len's mentorship is always professional, but it's also always geared towards prioritizing a student's need, even when that involves an early morning ride. For lack of a better term, I think this is a type of holistic mentorship, one that acknowledges students not just as students, but also as people. And because grad students so often tie their sense of self-worth and value solely and excruciatingly to academic accomplishment, to have a mentor who sees us as more than that is extremely powerful and extremely, extremely meaningful. Indeed, Len wants for his students a type of success that exceeds the number of publications or awards, though of course he'll help us celebrate those too. Len wants his students to lead healthy, fulfilling lives, and in this case, he quite literally went the extra mile to support that. The last event I want to discuss is when Len, Nancy, and their dog, Emma Golden, took me into their home for several days when I was facing a crisis situation where I feared for the safety of a student and for myself. I've already mentioned Len's enormous sense of compassion, so I won't belabor it here again. There are, of course, other virtues that need extolling. So I'm going to instead focus on the two main things that Len taught me about scholarship through this more personal ordeal. The first is that Len makes a mean ratatouille. um, Seriously, this was probably the best meal I've had in Durham. You know, roux clair, vin rouge, be damned, they have nothing on Len's French cooking. It was an exceptional meal. And the second is that work can be therapeutic. Stressful, yes, definitely, but also good for the spirit. Len teaches his students that academic work invests us in a community, one that reaches far beyond the pages of our dissertations, our articles, or our books. Len shows his students that work can lift us out of even the most troubling times and can create insight and meaning in ways that change how our community both understands and acts within the world. To put it differently, Len shows his students how scholars can be problem solvers. Len pushes his students to think not just about what our scholarship says, but importantly, what it does. Len shows us how to diagnose, how to address, and how to resolve the problems we find most compelling. And Len accomplishes this feat in a myriad of ways. For me, this guidance often took the form of frequent provocations like, okay, Jackie, what's your argument? Okay, Jackie, what's your argument? And my favorite, oh, Jackie, is that what you're arguing? But of course, by the end of my dissertation, I did indeed figure out what I was arguing. But I think here maybe I'm digressing a little bit too much. What makes Len's mentorship so impactful is his ability to teach students how to solve pressing problems, whether they're rooted in English novel reading cultures or enacted in the works of Shakespeare, or from my own research as a product of the rise of the experiment. At each stage of the research project, Len won't allow his students to think of their work as unimportant or as frivolous or as a product of the ivory tower. To put it simply, Len shows his students that their work matters, that they matter. And I truly cannot think of a more important quality in a mentor than that. Len, you have shaped your students into compassionate, sharp problem solvers. You've shaped us into scholars who embrace our responsibility to contribute to our communities. And while we may never be able to give back all that you've imparted to us, you can rest assured that we will pay it forward. Thank you so much, Len.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you. I'm Astrid Juni, and I'm currently a lecturer here in the English department at Duke. And I was lucky enough to have Len Tennenhouse as a teacher during many graduate courses and on my dissertation committee. First of all, I wanted to thank Charlotte for organizing this panel, as it is really rare to have the occasion to thank in person, or as close as Zoom makes in person possible, scholars and mentors who have made a real difference to our intellectual and academic development. Having had the pleasure and fortune of having Len Tennenhouse as a member of my dissertation committee, I will frankly admit, like everybody else here, that the request to speak about his work and his influence on my own graduate work is a rather daunting prospect. It is not just the sheer breadth of Len's work, spanning from Milton and Shakespeare to Hobbes and Locke and on to the American novel, that makes it difficult to adequately capture and celebrate his career in the time that I have. But also the fact that it is difficult for any student to articulate in full the many depths hidden deeply in one's work and thinking that we accumulate in the course of receiving advice, help, and encouragement from a committee member. Because of that, I would like to focus on just two particular points of gratitude that I owe Len Tennenhouse. The first is a direct contribution to my own thinking about the interaction of politics and literature in the 17th century. And the second, a debt I owe him as a teacher, a debt that I hope I'm repaying every day towards my own students. My dissertation focused on John Milton's work up to the Restoration, a perhaps unusual choice as I managed to miss all the major poetry that we think of when we think of Milton. But this choice led me to think carefully through questions that have always been a through line in Len Tennenhouse's own work. Questions of justice and sovereignty, of participation in political life and social communities, as well as of long-term formulations of nationhood and national identity. As the remarks of the two other members of this panel have made clear, and I'm sure the following remarks will continue to make clear, Len's research, teaching, and writing over the past 3 decades has richly illuminated conceptualization of the early modern passions and forms of epistemologies, versions of sovereignty and community in Shakespeare and drama more generally, as well as reimagine the national, cultural, and political import of formal generic differences. And while at the time of my graduate studies, I could not see this clearly, the classes that I took with Len and the feedback on my writing that he generously provided left a rather important, if surprising mark on my own work and thinking. My own reading of 17th century literature is deeply indebted to my engagement with virtue ethics and the work of Alistair MacIntyre. In numerous meetings, Len would push back on my writing and thinking, asking me to articulate the assumptions embedded in my theoretical framework. His questions and comments reminded me to think with greater precision about the role of conflict, whether political, legal, or literary, if we can distinguish between those, in producing representations of identity, be they political or religious. Conversations with Len about the English Civil War and its historiography were always stimulating and helped me to question in depth how the historical narratives that I relied on were being formed and written. I will admit that, at least at times, Len's suggestions and comments were somewhat prophetic and inscrutable in nature. I still remember leaving his office feeling rather lost after I'd come to ask questions about the Putney debates and receiving a rather cryptic answer. And I quoted to the best of my memory that historians actually believe that the objects of their studies exist. This comment has remained from me for over 10 years, and I'm still not sure that in my interpretation of it matches Len's intention in making it. But it is nonetheless a reminder to maintain a healthy sense of the provisional nature of all historiography, a reminder that I come back to frequently in my own writing. When I was a graduate student, it helped me to think less single-mindedly about Milton, Hobbes, Marvell, and the other protagonists of the 17th century, and to bring a more critical eye to the historical fiction that we tell ourselves when we focus on the canon of the period. In Len's comments and advice, literary style was always more than just an author-specific signature. His teaching pushed me to think of style and formal elements in literature as pointing towards larger questions of social and political connections. He often illuminated the ways that rhetoric and style participated in and redirected artistic traditions in pursuit of political projects. He also always made clear the importance of literary writing and of poetry in particular in the formation of historical and political narratives. In class discussions in particular, as well as the one-on-one conversations that I was lucky to have with them, Len's insistence on the centrality and function of formal elements of writing always created a path for any graduate student, and certainly for me, to learn how to trace and study literary history. I want to finish by sharing what I learned from Len as a teacher and what I hopefully have learned to bring to my own classroom. Here, I find myself somewhat timid from articulating what I actually apply in my classes because Len warned me that whatever we think we're doing in a classroom is not necessarily what our students perceive. So the best that I can do is to recall what left the most important and lasting impression on me from his courses, and what I hope I carry forward in my own teaching. And just as a little bit of a warning, I do not mean this to be a comment on the environment in Len's classroom, but the most memorable series of class meetings that I can remember was about Hobbes' Leviathan. In a course that spanned from King James' Basilican Doran to Shakespeare and Nahum Tate's King Lear, and on to Machiavelli's account of Caterina Riaria Sforza, the discussion of Hobbes still managed to spark some of the most exciting class conversation on the nature of sovereignty that I've ever had. Though I will admit that Len's discussion of Caterina Sforza's take on dynamic preservation is difficult to forget. In this class, I learned to enjoy reading Hobbes, which made working through his epistemology, his account of human nature and the mind, as well as his politics, a much more pleasant, though I will not say easy task. I credit Len's ability as a teacher capable of clearly drawing the connections between political theory and rhetoric, between forms of authority and literary adaptations, for my own willingness to attempt to teach Hobbes in my classes. Whenever I do so, I hope to be able to make my discussion as clear and as enjoyable as Len's. But his kindness and mentorship did not only last through my graduate career, but continued after. Even after graduation, Len has been supportive of my focus on the implementation of computational methods in undergraduate classes. I remember running into Len at the Perf, the coffee shop here nearby the library, 3 or 4 years ago, and mentioning some of the statistics and coding that I've been brushing on for computational undergraduate projects. With usual generosity, Len was immediately encouraging, even though he said that he wasn't not at all familiar with the ins and outs of natural language processing. And I think this is a testament of Len's ability to really be genuinely interested in whatever their students were pursuing as research avenues. His enthusiasm for students and former students' intellectual development is representative of Len as a teacher. While I'm not sure that Len ever agreed with my conclusions and reading of the English Civil War prose, his comments and his advice were always generous, intellectually stimulating, and given with my best interest in mind. And this generosity and care he demonstrated towards all of his students, time and time again. I'm very grateful for Len Tennenhouse's presence in my graduate career, and he will be deeply missed from the department. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Whitney Tratine. I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. And before I was at Penn, I was at UNC Chapel Hill for 2 years. But before that, I did my PhD at Duke. I entered in 2009 with Jackie in the same class and graduated in 2015 with a dissertation that was written under the supervision in part of Len Tennenhouse. Len, it's really great to be here. Over and above everything else, I wanted to wish you a really happy retirement. It caps many decades of brilliant scholarship, spanning at least 2 continents, 4 centuries, and every genre of literature I can think of. Your work has shown us how to read fiction as a political argument, which I think Julianne talked to really well. And the fact that we now take this kind of for granted is powerful testimony to the impact that you've had on the field. And by field, I don't just mean early modern drama or early American literature or novel studies, but of course all of literary studies, because your work is that capacious. Your retirement also caps many decades of distinguished mentorship, and that's what I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about today from my own experiences, having had the privilege to have worked with Len. When I first came to Duke in 2009, I was a bit of an odd duck. You know the type. I was one of those grad students who's smart and curious and eager to learn, but lacked a certain specificity. Some students come in already sharp around the edges. They know they want to study sentimental novels. They know they want to study Black Mountain College's poetry. They're ready to go. But I was pretty blurry. I had just done a master's in media studies at MIT, but I loved Old English. I loved critical theory. I probably mentioned something about being an early modernist in my application, but that's really only because I wanted to study the history of print. And while my curiosity was enough to get me in, it certainly didn't give me any clue as to how to function at an elite institution like Duke. What the hell was I doing here? I thought in that lonely first year. And as they do in grad school, folks kindly started to take this odd duck under their wing. I have many specific memories. One of my favorite is that David Ayres let me crash a medievalist party at his house. I'll never forget him telling me, well, you just looked like you didn't have anywhere to go, and it's important to find your people. But it was Len, actually, who made many of these dizzyingly opaque moments not only teachable, but very tolerable for me, which is to say, he didn't just invite me into the club, but he tried to show me something about how it operates, the rules of engagement, all the stuff that I, as a curious working class kid, didn't already know. He didn't just let me flounder, he gave me a map and said, here, this is what this symbol means, learn this language. He didn't need to do this. He was chair at the time, and I was barely even an early modernist, but he did, and he did it for me personally at parties and gatherings. He introduced me to visiting speakers, and he invited me into an intellectual exchange as a colleague, which is rare, I think, helping me learn how to navigate these choppy waters. But he also gave me this roadmap intellectually, pushing me always to refine my terms in ways that would make my wild ideas legible to others in the field. For instance, I very vividly remember being in his office, which was the chair's office, which is everything's probably different now, but had that long table filling the whole room. And we were talking about something that I had written on gender and the cut-up books of Little Gidding, which would eventually become my dissertation project. And what I had written, I'm quite sure now wasn't good at all. I probably thought that it was at the time, but I'm sure it wasn't. And he let me go on for a bit and then said to me in that direct way that he does, and Astrid talked to this very well, I think, what are we talking about when we talk about women's work here? What's that word mean to you, woman? I was a little bit bewildered, and I'll admit a lot annoyed. Because, gender, he said, was not the same to early moderns as it is to us. And he got up and he went straight to Thomas Lacker's Making Sex. How he knew exactly where it was on his bookshelf, I don't know. He was always kind of just going to the exact right spot on the shelf, and opened right to the page with the diagram showing the vagina as an inverted penis. And he kind of jabbed his finger at that page and said, see, one sex. Now, what is gender in a culture that thinks that? And I had no idea how to answer that question, but I left with an armful of books and spent the next few years trying to work it out. And I certainly haven't forgotten that it was Len who set me down that path. Len is tough like this. He will put your ideas in a kiln to make sure they come out really well baked with no weak spots. But for as tough as he is on your ideas, he's incredibly generous in giving you the space and support that you need for those ideas to flourish. And here's where I want to share that Len, while he probably doesn't remember it, made possible the most important thing that has happened to me in my career and that kind of set me down the intellectual trajectory that I then went on. I was in his office one day for another meeting, probably about another terrible piece of writing that I was working on. Another thing about Len's generosity is that he was always willing to read and comment on my work, which now that I think about him being chair at the time and doing that is pretty incredible. And when I mentioned to him that I really needed to get more formal training in bibliography, he was receptive. I argued we didn't have anything like that at Duke, and I said I really need to go to Rare Book School at UVA and take this notoriously difficult intro to descriptive bibliography, kind of week-long boot camp in all things Def Bib. And he said, okay, so what's stopping you? And I told him, well, I don't have the funds for tuition. I was supporting a parent at the time. I didn't have money for travel or lodging. And he said, well, that's no problem. And he sat down at his desk and wrote an email to the admin right then and there, asking them to release money from his personal research funds to offset my tuition. And it probably didn't seem like much to him at the time. And he certainly acted like it wasn't. But to this poor grad student, it was absolutely everything. It made it possible for me to attend. And I even remember very carefully, like trying to pick out a gift for him while I was at Rare Book School to thank him for how much this meant to me. And that class, no exaggeration, definitely changed my intellectual trajectory forever, because it is where I did meet my people, as I was exhorted to do, and where I gained the skills to put into practice all those ideas that Len was teaching me about, into action in the archives. And I actually think about this act of generosity quite often and have repaid it as a mentor myself in recent years. Len has not always agreed with my approach to things, and probably still doesn't. I think he'll readily tell you that. But what we share, and what in fact he has taught me, is that it's in these moments of disagreement that the humanities truly thrives. Critique, dialectics, peer review, these are not processes, as Len has taught me, to be rushed through and over, but they're the substances of our work, as we sit around some ill-shaped conference table, grabbing piles of books and sharing them with each other. It's what sets our cultural production apart from other types of labor in the neoliberal capitalist system we find ourselves embedded within, hopefully as something of a thorn in its gargantuan side. And Len, I thank you for these lessons. Thanks.
Hello, Len and everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I've really very much enjoyed listening to the contributions that you've all made about Len's scholarship and his mentorship. I'm just going to talk a brief word about Len's scholarship by way of an addendum. And then I want to talk about Len's kindness. And then I want to talk about Len as a chair, because I inherited that role from him. I think you've all spoken marvelously to Len's scholarship. And I wanted to say, give a little plug for his very early work, which is as an editor of some Tudor interludes. Probably, Len, that was quite a distant memory to you, but nevertheless, a sort of incredibly useful contribution to Medren drama. And then the wide-ranging nature of your professional contributions, obviously as a mentor, which people have talked about here, but also on the editorial board of all kinds of journals such as Cultural Critique and Genders and 18th Century Fiction, a really, really wide range there. And as Julianne has said, a real contribution to Renaissance drama. And I want to add that although Len was and has been so often classified with the new historicists, when one thinks about his work in the longue durée, I think I would want to differentiate whatever new historicism is. I suppose it's most associated with the work of Stephen Greenblatt now. I think Len always brought to his own contributions to what is retrospectively called a movement a much sharper sense of the work of ideology, and a much more pointed sense of the constitution of a specifically political sphere. I think in Len's work, you have a sense that not all power is political, and a sense of what makes a public act into a political one. And to that extent, I think he is sometimes rather different from the sort of group that was molded together in those new historicist ways. I agree with Julianne that his work on Renaissance drama is hugely valuable. And I also want to pay tribute to the fact of collaboration. You've all mentioned the numerous ways in which Len and Nancy have produced such an astonishing body of work towards the history of the novel, towards transatlantic relations, towards the imbrication of the literary forms of English, England and America. And I think the sheer fact of their extraordinarily creative collaboration over the years is worth mentioning, because we tend to work in very monadic and isolated ways as scholars. And I think it's a tribute to Len's collaborative work. This marriage with Nancy was also a true intellectual marriage, which I think produced some astonishingly provocative and interesting work. I wanted to say something about Len's kindness. You have all mentioned that because I think it was and is a very striking thing about you, Len. And I remember, this is a tiny incident and you probably don't even remember it, but I remember one time we were both leaving the Allen building after sort of a long day there, and it was getting dark, and you realized that my car wouldn't start. My Mini, that was by that stage about 14 years old, would not start. And you offered to wait and to, do things with jump cords and cables and wait around for the AAA to come. I mean, that wasn't necessary, but it was the offer of help that was just so kind on a dark winter's night. And I think that this really is such a consistent thing about you as a colleague. And I want to mention here that you chaired the department for 2 terms. Bravo. And you took on the leadership of the English department when you'd only been at Duke, I think, for just maybe 1 year. A really hard thing, I think, to do in a new university, but a productive thing to do to bring in values and experience from the range of different schools that you had worked in. But you came in as chair at a time of financial crisis. It was 2009. The university was grappling with the implications of the 2008 crash, and it was at a time when all chairs were being asked to cut 20% from their budget. So it was a time of crisis when you came into the role, a time of trying to conserve what we had, trying not to lose staff, trying to maintain the ship. And I want to say the stakes were very high, because this is a question of actually maintaining and keeping people's jobs and people's livelihood, especially amongst the staff. And I think you did that in a really impeccable way. And I want to say that I think 2009 and the years in which you entered the chairship were also a time of another kind of crisis in higher education, which was the way in which we're beginning to experience the bite of falling enrollments. That's been a pattern since that time. And I think you worked with a great deal of, I want to say, technical rigor and thoughtfulness in trying to reverse that trend, trying to reverse those patterns in an incredibly challenging environment. But I also want to say that as a chair, one of the things that distinguished you was your works of, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but what I want to say, your supererogatory acts. It seems to me that you always did more than what was asked for. And I say this because while you were chair, Len, you crazy man, you were also interim DUS for a year. That is an astonishing act of service. And you also served on numerous independent studies. I remember particularly Lindsay Lahr, who was one of our graduate students who wrote a beautiful dissertation on works of mercy. And you were mentoring her, doing independent studies with her while you were chair. And I think provided an absolutely vital intellectual backbone at a time when no one else was teaching the works of the 17th century poets that you read and studied with her, and I think were vitally influential in helping to shape and form her work on Herbert and Donne, and indeed Shakespeare. Those were supererogatory acts. But you also do the kind of thing that, again, I would say are acts of supererogation. I'm not going to be able to say that word, the kind of thing that is a completely selfless task, writing, proposing people for teaching awards, proposing people for mentoring awards, proposing colleagues for distinguished chairs, for example. This takes the most enormous amount of very precise and very detailed work. But it's an act that makes both acknowledges the kind of work, scholarly, mentoring, pedagogic, that is part of our roles, and also lifts the entire department by noticing and elevating standards of excellence. Now, there's one thing that you did that I think was rather fascinating and controversial in our department. I have been in this department for quite a long time, and so I have been witness to many chairs, and after you, I chaired the department myself as well. But what you did, Len, was an act that nobody who preceded you did this. Nobody who succeeded you succeeded in doing this. Charlotte, the challenge is out to you. And that is, if you remember, the present that you gave to me, from you to me as I took the baton of chair, was Robert's Rules of Order. Now, I don't know what, I expect it was the 3rd edition of the 12th edition, maybe. Or maybe it was the 2nd edition of the 11th edition. I don't know. But the point was that when you chaired the department, all of a sudden, and to our shock, but I think in the end, I felt we really saw the usefulness of it. We met, we moved, we postponed, we amended, we committed, we questioned, we tabled, and we adjourned, according to Robert's Rules of Order. And my favorite memory of your many times chairing a department, which is one of the most challenging things, frankly, that you do as a chair, is to chair meetings, because it's, as we all know, it's like herding cats. But I remember the time when Melissa Malouf asked rather confusedly, you had said, is it a point of order or a point of information? And she said, I don't know. In any case, this are the sort of fun that you had. I don't know how you kept it all in your head, but you did. And I think that you worked. Not only were you an unbelievably hardworking chair with a permanently open door, but you were also, I think, a chair of fairness and transparency. Hence, I think the Robert's Rules of Order. So, Len, I think it's been a pleasure to be your colleague over the 14 years that you have been here. I am so delighted that you decided to come to Duke, and then when you got here, gave so very, very generously of your time and your energy. And I wish you very, very well as an emeritus professor of this university.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone who spoke. That was just really moving, and I'm sure, I hope it was for Len, but for, I think, the rest of us here, also to hear about this history of the department, and also just a general tribute to the power of mentorship and teaching and collegiality that we have heard from, and scholarship, of course, that we've heard from everybody. That was just really amazing. I thought I was gonna have to go get the tissues out. So thank you to our panelists, and of course my own personal thanks to Len for many acts of kindness over my time at Duke and his time here. And there's one other thing. Oh, and especially for Robert's Rules of Order. I actually hadn't realized that, Sarah, until you said it, that that's one we had, which I feel exactly the same way. I'm like, oh no, but every time I chair a meeting, I am grateful for the rules of order that Len instituted in our department. They have been incredibly useful. and for the legacy, I think, of good stewardship of the department inaugurated during Len's chairship that have come down to me through Sarah and through Rob. It's really amazing to work in a department that is has been so well run for so long. It's a gift. So again, we are very happy to forward anything. The department is very happy to forward any cards or other things that you would like sent along to Len. And of course, you are all welcome to write him directly, to email him. And yeah, I will just say thank you again, and thank you, Len, so much for your incredible generosity and service to Duke and to the profession and to scholarship. And we all, I echo all the wishes that the panelists have expressed for wonderful retirement and being an emeritus professor. So thank you, everybody. And I think that we will be able to end it here. I feel like I should do so. I didn't prepare a joke related to Robert's Rules of Order, but you can insert your own here. I think we're ready to adjourn. So thank you, everybody.